2 years of war, threats of regional spillover and attacks on a US ally. Gulf nations are grappling with an increasingly unstable and unpredictable Middle East. A new security pact between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan suggests traditional US partners are seeking alternatives, that according to regional analysts. Is this the start of a regional defence shake-up? I'm Melinda Nusafora, and you're watching Counterpoints. Could this handshake reshape security in the Middle East? Resources-rich Saudi Arabia and nuclear-armed Pakistan have signed a mutual defence agreement. Aggression against one will be considered aggression against both. Sound familiar? It echoes Article 5 of NATO, leading some analysts to wonder if an Islamic NATO could be on the cards. Even though officials say this deal has been in the works for about 2 years, the timing of the announcement is significant. It came just a week after Israel bombed Qatar for the second time without any fallout from ally the US. On this show, we'll debate if the Saudi-Pakistan defence deal will reshape security in the Middle East, whether Israel's actions and US inaction has damaged the credibility of existing security partners, and if this bilateral mutual defence deal is just the beginning. Joining us to discuss the shifting security dynamics across the Middle East and beyond is Senator Mushahid Hussain Syed, former Pakistani Minister for Communication and Culture and chairman of the Pakistan-China Institute, which is releasing a report on the Pakistan-Saudi Strategic Defence Agreement on September 26th. Jasmine El-Gamal is joining us, foreign policy analyst, host of the View from Here podcast and a former Pentagon Middle East advisor. And rounding out our panel is Ruth Wasserman-Landi, former Israeli Knesset member for the opposition Blue and White Party and founding co-chair of Knesset's Abraham Accords caucus. To our panellists, welcome to Counterpoints. 5 years ago, those accords between Israel and several Arab countries opened a new chapter for geopolitics in the Middle East, with the US its key architect. Now, a wariness of US reliability and increased Israeli aggression has it on the brink of unravelling. Given rising tensions and instability in the region, it's really not surprising that nations are taking bolder steps to bolster new alliances. So let's begin with you, Ruth. Do you think that the Saudi-Pakistan defence deal is going to reshape the security architecture in the Middle East?
So first of all, good evening, and thank you for having me on this platform. It's an honor. It is a very important thing to take into account in the geostrategy of the region. I think that Pakistan, being a very, very important and powerful country in its own subcontinent, together with the Saudi power and impact on the Islamic Sunni world, is quite something to take into account. And yet, I don't believe that this needs to necessarily be seen as a threat. Why? Because there is zero intent from the Israeli point of view, either vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, in terms of anything that can be malevolent, given the current situation and or any situation that I can bring to mind. And that is, of course, keeping in mind that there is a huge potential to be had with furthering and further boosting, in fact, the Abraham Accords. And that really depends on the will of the members as to what they are intending to do. If it is to protect one another from any kind of invasion or aggression, then Israel has absolutely nothing to fear because it has zero intent to be an aggressor towards either one of those countries. There is no reason to be so. And therefore, I see opportunity, potential opportunity possibly for countries in the region as per this new alignment. And of course, we all know that there are many alignments taking place in the region in the current situation because it does worry many of the role players in the region. And we take that into account, of course.
Senator, what do you make of what Ruth has been saying there? Do you think that Pakistan, Saudi, maybe the region in general feels confident that Israel has zero intent of being an aggressor?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in such distinguished company, and I think it's a very topical issue. I would say the context should be first discussed. The context is the volatile, turbulent, transformative Middle East, where conflicts are raging, wars are being launched, and I think the Israeli aggression against Qatar was the turning point for Saudi Arabia. And of course, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have a long track record of a very strong and solid relationship, which extends to the domains of diplomacy and defense as well. And as the lady rightly pointed out, Pakistan's military prowess and Saudi economic strength have a unique combination. And in that context, it's a purely defensive initiative from the two Muslim brothers, Muslim brotherly countries, and they feel that in case, should there be any possibility of threat of aggression, then perhaps they can combine their strengths. I would agree that as of now, we do not see that, certainly not in the case of Pakistan, because our main security threat is confined to our own region in South Asia vis-a-vis India, although we understand fully that India is a very close military ally of Israel. And during the recent Indian war against Pakistan, where the Indians got a bloody nose from Pakistan, by the way, they did use Israel's Harop drones. And some of the reports suggest that they were being also manned by the Israelis because they're quite sophisticated. But having said that, so far, I think we both, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, have a very good relationship with the person who matters and who has the key to peace and stability in the region. And that is President Donald Trump in Washington, D.C., because he has that kind of ingress in Israel. He has a very close rapport with Saudi Arabia, and he has also a very good relationship currently with Pakistan. So I do not foresee eruption of hostilities as of now. But of course, after Qatar, what happened to Qatar, and the fact that the U.S. was unable to protect Qatar, despite their long-standing defense relationship, despite the Al Udeid base, despite American equipment. So I think the feeling was in Saudi Arabia, perhaps, that they should look at strategic options elsewhere. And Pakistan, of course, is a very feasible alternative, given our relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Jasmine, what do you make of that? How do you view the agreement there? Given the recent events, is this a shake-up of security in the Middle East? And do you think that Washington, the West, Israel, should be worried?
First of all, thank you so much, Melinda. It's good to be back with you on the show and to be in such good company. I think really the two things that we are looking at here when we're talking about this situation are trust and accountability. Those are really the two principles that are driving a lot of what you see happening post-strike on Doha. I understand what Ruth is saying. I understand that on the surface of it, one would think that Saudi Arabia would have nothing to fear because Israel has no reason to attack Saudi Arabia. But the genuine feeling and the prevalent feeling in the region now is, well, but neither did Qatar. This was such an unprecedented thing that happened, and particularly since reportedly the Mossad had provided assurances to the leadership in Doha that they wouldn't be attacked for having Hamas members on their ground. Particularly because those Hamas members had been invited to Doha at the request of the US and Israel. And they were there trying to negotiate an end to the war. And even that didn't stop Prime Minister Netanyahu from ordering that strike on Qatar. So that really shook the region. It really meant that you can trust nothing now. Yes, there's no reason for Israel to attack Saudi Arabia, but what if? That is the question on people's minds. What if? And so they've had to now look outwards and look at other opportunities to bolster their own security. Now, that's about the trust issue. The accountability issue is just as important. The accountability factor here matters because the fact that Israel did not face any accountability for striking a major non-NATO U.S. ally that hosts a major U.S. base on its territory also has people thinking about U.S. security guarantees and what they actually mean. So if you take both of those things together, I hope that provides, this is, from everyone that I've been talking to in the region, whether my Saudi contacts, Qatari, Emirati, this is what they're saying. They're saying we can't trust anyone. We can't trust the U.S. It doesn't mean that we're going to jeopardize our relationship with the U.S. That's not it. But we are going to take steps to ensure that we are secure, even if we can't trust and depend on the U.S.
Ruth, your reaction to that? Is there a distinct lack of trust?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to answer that. You speak of Israel as the aggressor. And yet I don't see it in that way. And if there is anybody that understands the Qatari double game, anyone in the region, more than anyone in the region, it's Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia ousted Qatar several years ago from the GCC together with other allies because of its double game, because it was playing creating instability, in fact, feeding instability, and then crying about it and pretending to try and be the mediator about it. And really, the GCC countries perhaps know and understand that all too well. Al-Jazeera is a tool that was used and is still used against every single one of them.
Things are quite different now, though. And they are working together, a lot of these GCC countries, and they're standing together quite firmly.
So at the moment, they are standing together very similarly to the way that they stood together with Assad after they ousted him. But as we all know, and especially the Arab Muslim country all know, that apart from declarative aspect, there is the de facto aspect, and there is zero trust amidst those role players towards Qatar. And that is the truth and not what is being declared and said. Now, I understand that attacking the Hamas leadership in Qatar is a very significant move. I would not say unprecedented, because very recently the Islamic Republic of Iran did exactly the same. Afterwards, sitting and crying together with Qatar, hand in hand, over their terrible misfortune, which everybody understands is completely hypocritical. But it's not unprecedented. It is, however, very significant, and I totally understand that. However, Saudi Arabia does not harbor Muslim Brotherhood senior leadership or Hamas leadership that plans to eliminate rhetorically and in terms of attempts de facto on the ground, rape, murder, and massacre Israeli civilians. They don't do that. In fact, they outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood because they well understand the dangers of the Muslim Brotherhood, like the UAE, like Bahrain, like Egypt, like Jordan. And therefore, Israel will never, ever take any kind of aggressive step towards any country, because its idea was not to attack Qatar at all. It was just to hurt those leadership. And whoever understands in military, like the gentleman sitting over here, who is an expert, and Jasmine, who is also an expert, they know that the equipment used was very, very precise. I would say even too precise, which is why the actual operation failed.
So, sorry, Ruth, can I just step in here real quick? Because I just want to get to this point that you're not really addressing the points that I made, which is that Hamas was asked, that Qatar was asked to host Hamas for these negotiations. And in fact, when Qatar tried to expel them last year, both Israel and the US asked them to keep them in that territory. So this is a really important point here, because I'm not, there's no love lost for Hamas when I talk when I talk about them, and obviously what happened on October 7th was unequivocally abhorrent. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the fact that Qatar was asked to host Hamas, that these Hamas members, some of whom had flown into Doha earlier that morning, were there to specifically review a proposal to end the war presented by Steve Witkoff, the US envoy, and were attacked while they were studying that proposal, which makes no sense, because then if they're dead, who was supposed to release the hostages, right? So, but that's a whole other story. And then, as much as you say that those weapons that were used were light, they did result in casualties, including an innocent Qatari security forces officer who lost his life.
They did result in one casualty, which is very tragic, and Israel apologized for that, and that's terrible. But they were not strong enough to actually kill many people in the building, because they just left the room and they were still in the same building. But that doesn't mean that the death was not tragic. What I do want to say is that the fact that the Hamas leadership, if they had been eliminated in that specific act, the war would have been over immediately, because they are the ones that are maintaining a stronghold, including Qatar, that is playing a double role, a hypocritical double role, vis-a-vis the leadership on the ground in Gaza, actually using the civilians of Gaza in order to have them killed on and on, instead of them being sitting in a 5-star hotel in Doha and making the conditions again and again more difficult to make the negotiation. This is something that would have been completely eradicated had they been eliminated, and the war would have been over. Because if we have our hostages back and we don't have the Hamas armed and saying very clearly that they would like to eliminate us and they will eliminate us and do everything in their power, there is no war with Gaza. We were not in war with Gaza since 2006. Nothing, not at all. On the contrary. Therefore, I believe that the leadership in Doha, sitting with the hospitality of Doha, in Doha, in the 5-star hotels, while their people are actually on the ground.
Okay.
This is what prevented any kind of movement with a negotiation.
Okay, I just want to pivot us back to...
That's not true. I know we need to get to the senator, but Ruth, we can't sit here and pretend that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not the reason that there hasn't been a ceasefire. Your own press has reported repeatedly that Netanyahu is the one who has not been willing to sign for the negotiations because he knows he would lose his coalition and then be subject to the full extent of the law inside of Israel. So let's please be honest about the role of Prime Minister Netanyahu in the negotiations.
I'm very honest. Jasmine, I'm very honest. And as I was introduced, I'm in the opposition to Netanyahu. I don't belong to Netanyahu. I don't represent Netanyahu. And actually, I disagree with him on a lot of aspects. But he is not the reason why the negotiations are not moving forward. In fact, he brought many of the hostages back. I'm not a spokesperson for him. Again, I don't belong to his party. But if you want to tell me that the Hamas is a pure, and the Qataris are a pure mediator in this negotiation, then honesty is something that we should rediscuss and redefine from the beginning of this conversation.
Okay, we're not going to get too bogged down in the Israel-Gaza negotiations as such. I want to pivot us back to this security arrangement in the region a bit more broadly and bring in the Senator here for your views on what we've been hearing there, Senator. Also, you say that this is a deterrence arrangement, but even that sort of heated discussion as we're talking about how tense this region is there any concern from Pakistan that it could find itself dragged into this regional conflict through this mutual security agreement?
Before I answer your question, let me just interject the discussion that was taking place earlier. Because you see, when Israel launched two wars of aggression, I would say, both were done first through deception and then aggression. For example, the attack on Iran was on 13th of June, while Iran was preparing for negotiations with the United States on 15th of June. So there was this element of deception also on the part of both Washington and its proxy, Israel. And then as Jasmine rightly said, the Hamas is there by arrangement, and Mossad has been negotiating with Hamas. The CIA has been negotiating with Hamas in Doha with the concurrence of all these countries, like they did in the case of Afghanistan 10 years ago with the Afghan Taliban, who were holed up also in Doha. So again, there was this element of deception. They were getting ready for negotiations on different aspects, including the hostages, and this was done. So this is very clearly a country which is a serial aggressor, because it's not just the genocide in Gaza or Iran or Qatar or Lebanon or Syria or Yemen. So it's a serious, there's a feeling of greater Israel that perhaps Eretz Israel, as Netanyahu calls it.
The smallest country on the face of the planet is an aggressor and an imperialist. My apologies, it's very difficult for me to hear that a country much smaller than any of the countries we're talking about is the aggressor and an imperialist country. It's completely insane. You can barely see it on the map. A country that every single
Israel
Arab
plus
and
America,
Muslim
actually.
country
Israel is not
has
alone.
been an
Israel is a
aggressor
proxy for
towards
the
my
United
own
States.
people. My children are
I
not
think if
safe
Israel was
here.
alone,
My
it's different, but I
children,
think
as a mother,
Israel also pulls the strings in Washington, D.C., as we can see, that Trump is helpless in front of Netanyahu, and they gave the green light for everything. So regarding what you asked me about Pakistan's role, we have been playing this role in the region also. If you remember, Pakistan has had a very strong military defense arrangement with different Arab countries in the past. We have been the most active in training missions in mostly all the Gulf countries. In the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, for example, the Ramzan war or the October war or the Yom Kippur war, Pakistani pilots were flying for the Syrian Air Force, by the way. And so we took part in that. And also with King Faisal, we hosted the Islamic Summit in Lahore, where PLO under Yasser Arafat was recognized. So Pakistan has had a very strong, perhaps because of, shall we say, pan-Islamism or Islamic Brotherhood, not Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic Brotherhood or Islamic solidarity. There is this camaraderie among Muslim countries, and Pakistan being a fairly large country, 250 million people with a large professional battle-inoculated armed force with a strong capability, has always been there to help our Muslim brothers during different kinds of conflict. So it's
Senator, if I can
we live in a very
back
difficult neighborhood in Pakistan and South Asia. We have faced Indian aggression, and India is, I think, the elder brother these days, ideological bedfellow of Israel, because both have similar ideological proclivities, shall we say.
Turning you back to one final point before we move on to our next segment, whether or not there's any concern from you, from commentators in Pakistan, that with the instability in the Middle East and this new mutual agreement that aggression on one is aggression on both, could see Pakistan drawn in to this conflict if it does spill over? I
think that Mr. Netanyahu, despite the full backing of the United States, essentially he has a mindset of a bully, and he goes for the weak. And I think he knows that, like, when they attacked Iran, they thought it would be a piece of cake. And Iranian gave them a bloody nose. It was a difficult battle for Israel. And the Iranians hit back very hard and broke through the Iron Dome. And Netanyahu was pleading with Trump for peace and for a ceasefire. So I think that he is also aware that who to hit, because I think he hits the weak and the helpless. And he knows countries like Pakistan or Turkey, shall we say, or Iran, have the military strength to hit back and also give them a tit for their tat.
Ruth,
So
your
we don't
response
see that
before we move on?
right now for that.
I think this is a ridiculous conversation, thinking that a very small country like Israel, you just mentioned that Pakistan has 250 million Muslims. And as I said, and I began my words with a great respect, that Israel has absolutely zero intention of aggression. And on the contrary, all I hear is that Israel is an imperialist country. I didn't laugh when you were talking, sir. I would very much accept your respect to me as a human being and as a person. But you don't have to. It's just a recommendation. But Israel, being an imperialist country, barely being seen on the map with 10 million people, 2 million of whom are Arab Israelis, the majority of which are Muslim, it's quite astounding that we are spending an hour talking about the aggression of a Mr. Netanyahu with countries with such power and such impact, such as the countries that you represent. It almost seems quite astounding that you would see them, such countries, as a threat. Israel does not attack countries in general. Israel responds to attacks. And I can tell you, sir, that our women were ravaged, massacred, burnt. Villages, whole villages were massacred with underground tunnels. We were not in Gaza for years. We had absolutely no war, no intention to war. On the contrary, there were people working in the very homes that they ravaged, and people were raping girls and raping women and kidnapping civilians from their beds.
And sorry,
My
can
own
we just,
children
if
could
we're
have
going, I
been
mean,
in
look,
that
Ruth,
situation.
Ruth, you can
So
talk
talking
about
aggression,
exactly everything that you're talking about is also happening across Gaza, across the West Bank. I think
we
we're
don't
here to
rape
talk
any
about the security
Gazans.
implications.
We never burn any Gazans. We have no
You
intention.
never
We have
burn
no
any
bad or
Gazans? What
ill
about the engineering
intention.
student?
We have
Sorry,
no
what
ill
about the engineering
intention
student?
against any
Melinda, can
Gazans.
you
We have
give us a
no
chance to
ill
respond, please?
intention
Because
against
a
any
lot of
Gazans.
lies
On
are
the
being
contrary.
Okay.
shared
The
here.
IDF, but I can tell you because I've been there. I don't know when last you were in Gaza, but the IDF is attempting to secure the civilians to leave the places
Melinda,
that are
I
being
will.
bombed. The
I
Hamas
can't
is
sit
I'll
here
bring you in
listening.
a moment,
stay
Jasmine.
in those very places. Not only are they making them stay in those places in order for them to be sacrificed for PR purposes. I saw this with my own eyes. Not only that, but they break their legs and shoot them in the knees to torture them in the public sphere.
Okay,
This is
all
the
right.
level
We're
of
going to have to keep
inhumanity
moving this on. We don't want to
Hamas
get
is
too bogged
practicing
down. Jasmine, I'm
their
going to
own
let you
people.
reply. Ruth, we'll leave it there for the moment. Jasmine, your response, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, I am going to respond. Listen, I empathize and sympathize with what Ruth said about being a mother and fearing for her children. I sympathize with every single mother who has to live in the Middle East and wonder if her child is going to be bombed or burned or struck at a moment's notice. So I want to acknowledge the humanity and the fear of everybody living in that region. It's certainly not unique to Israel, Ruth, but I do understand you and I empathize.
I agree.
I don't want to go in a tit for tat about who burned whom and what and where, okay? There was that awful, horrifying image, Ruth, of the engineering student, Shaban El-Dalu, who was in a hospital bed, basically, with an IV drip, when that camp that he was in, that refugee camp, was struck by Israel, and he was burned to death, and it was on live television. So we can talk about
Just a moment, Ruth. Let Jasmine respond, because we gave you the time, and we'll let Jasmine respond. Thank you, Jasmine.
This is not about who has suffered more. This is not about zero-sumness. This is about human suffering on a scale that we haven't seen before. And it doesn't have anything to do with the size of Israel, Ruth. Israel is better armed than all of those countries combined in the region. I've worked at the Defense Department. There is a law in the US that we are not allowed to provide any weapons to any Arab country that would give it a qualitative military edge over Israel. That is enshrined in law.
Only technologically.
Qualitative
Jasmine, only
military edge.
technologically.
That's
in
not
terms
true.
of
We wouldn't
numbers
even
and
provide,
size,
we
there
wouldn't
is a
even,
military advantage.
Ruth, if you just let Jasmine finish, because then I'm going to bring the senator in and we need to move on.
Ruth, we had trouble providing Cessna airplanes to the Lebanese armed forces because the Israelis objected to it. So this is not that, and no, not to mention that Israel is a nuclear power, which I know that you guys don't talk about. But this isn't here. This isn't about ganging up on Ruth. This isn't about talking about, you know, anything personal. This is about the fact that there is a strategy on the part of the Netanyahu government to militarily neutralize, red lines be damned, international law be damned, rules and promises be damned, everything that they deem as a threat. You're saying that Israel doesn't strike unless it's struck? What about in Syria? They've been striking in Syria ever since Ahmad al-Shara came to power for no reason. He even says over and over again, we are not interested in a conflict with Israel. We want to talk to Israel about a peaceful arrangement, and they keep getting bombed.
But in the meantime, Jasmine, they massacre, rape, and burn Druze, Alawites, Kurds.
Okay, I'm just going to interrupt you there, Ruth, only because I want to keep us on track and we can't go into the situation in Syria. So I'm going to just put a pin in that one.
Burning, massacring, kidnapping, and raping women. It's crazy.
That's not true, and that doesn't give Israel the right to
Okay, and we're not going to devolve into Syria. We'll have that discussion another day. I'm going to move us on.
It's not true. It's not true that the Sharia's men are burning Christian villages.
Okay, Ruth.
I don't think Syria is the topic of this debate, but I'm happy to talk to you about it another time.
Yeah, correct. Ruth, we are going to leave that topic there because that is a fact that's contested by the Syrian government, and we're not going to debate Syria today. We're going to keep our focus on
that was Al-Qaeda, you mean?
Okay,
Ruth, let's just move on, please.
Yeah, we're going to focus back on the security arrangements, particularly with this new deal.
7,000 Yazidis were kidnapped by those same.
There's too many issues for us to get bogged down in everything. So I'm going to keep us focused on the topic at hand. Now, even though we have been talking about,
let's obsessively be focused on Netanyahu.
Okay, Israel's Doha strikes, though, were widely perceived as a strategic failure. You said so yourself there, Ruth, that it wasn't a huge success. It failed to take out the Hamas leaders in Doha, but it also raised questions about US willingness to prevent attacks on its Gulf allies. And now, with Saudi Arabia's mutual defence pact with Pakistan, that timing seems significant. So, Senator, let's bring ourselves back to the topic at hand, this mutual defence pact and what it means for the region. Do you think that Israel's strikes on Doha were a turning point for the region? And do you think that the announcement, even though this pact has been in the work for years, that the announcement and the actual signing of this deal is significant?
Yes, I'll respond to your question, but I just want to make a comment on the earlier discussion. I didn't want to interrupt, but on an average, Israel has been killing one child every 1 hour during this Gaza genocide. And as far as the Palestinians are concerned in the occupied territories, whether it's the West Bank or Gaza, Israel is an imperialist and a neo-colonialist power, because they are subjugating the weak and oppressing the Palestinians and depriving them of their inalienable right of self-determination. Just to set the record straight. Coming to this question,
the record is very clear
because Qatar,
I'll come to you after this, Ruth.
Major
Senator,
non-NATO military ally. Yes. Qatar being a close ally, hosting the biggest American military base in the Middle East, 10,000 troops, also a very friendly country, not hostile even to Israel or to any other country. And all these people who are in Doha, Hamas leadership, etc., they are there by prior arrangement with the United States and with the, I would say, even the concurrence of the Israeli regime. So given that context, when that red line was crossed, I think that two things happened concurrently in the Gulf countries' worldview. One was that the main threat to their security, they would say, is now Israel, given what Israel's track record is, especially in the past couple of years. And secondly, I think a loss of faith in Washington, D.C. Already the so-called oil for security arrangement had fallen apart earlier, and Saudi Arabia had suffered that in 2019 when some of the oil installations were attacked in 2019. I think Trump was again president then. The U.S. Withdrew their Patriot missile batteries from there. So the U.S. is not seen as a credible, reliable, net security partner for these countries. Okay, notwithstanding their official alignments, I think it's a sophisticated bribe to Trump. They're giving so much money, $2 trillion and so forth, but it's not helping them. When it comes to the crunch, the U.S. Just looked the other way. And I would say there was a wink or a nod from Washington to whatever Netanyahu is doing. Somehow the Israeli lobby is so powerful. And I think maybe Trump is also being blackmailed by them on the Epstein files or whatever you call it. So I feel that he's helpless in that. He just cannot do anything. He does speak up and says, but even on the ceasefire, which Hamas had agreed, Witkoff had made an arrangement, it was sabotaged by the Israeli regime, by Netanyahu. So given that context, I think they've reached a conclusion that, okay, notwithstanding their posturing that the U.S. is still a friend and ally, I think that there's a lack of trust now in the United States, as Jasmine rightly pointed out, and they don't see the U.S. as a reliable, credible partner they can rely in a crisis. So they're looking at other options, and of course, Pakistan has had, as I mentioned, a very strong old relationship. And as we demonstrated when India attacked Pakistan, we gave them a bloody nose. They're 5 times our size, but we have a very professional force, highly motivated armed forces, and we sorted them out well and proper in May. And then when Israel did the same with Iran, the Iranians were shaken up in the first few days because their military high command and nuclear scientists were decimated, which also I would say would be an act of terrorism. If Iran did the same with the Israeli scientists in Tel Aviv, they would say it's an act of state terrorism, but nobody said a word. And even Chancellor Merz of Germany said, Israel is doing a dirty work for us. It is quite shameful how the Europeans have behaved on this issue. But having said that, so I think that
Of course, it's
overall
quite
there's
shameful,
an
but
inflection
Saudi
point in the
Arabia
Middle
would not
East,
think the same
and I think
like
you're
you.
seeing realignments,
Saudi Arabia were
and
rubbing
especially
their
vis-a-vis
hands
Israel,
and
vis-a-vis the United States, and looking at other strategic options.
Ruth,
And
your
Pakistan
reaction,
is seen
but
as
I
a credible
also
option and a
Ruth,
credible partner.
your reaction to that. But I also want to ask you, Ruth, if you think that the attacks on Doha have forced countries to come together against Israel. Is it almost as if Israel's forced their hand to take maybe a more proactive posture in the region?
I think that we are talking in 2 levels. One level is the real level, and the other level is the completely hypocritical level. We all sit here and we all know very well that Qatar is not only an aggressor towards Israel, not in the military sense, but in the economic sense. It is a very serious aggressor towards the entire Western world, not to mention countries that are in the region, for example, Egypt, Jordan, and others, because it instigates, incites, and encourages Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas-oriented, and other extremist Islamist groups that are infiltrated into institutions, political echelon, football clubs, and other cultural institutions throughout the West and in the region. In
so
fact,
whether or
Qatar
not Israel was justified in its
very
attack, I'm just curious as to whether you think the attack itself has maybe caused this coming together, more of a proactive sort of military stance against Israel.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that the Arab League countries have a lot in common with one another. Declaratively, they state a lot of brotherhood. I spent 3 whole years in Cairo. Not that I was allowed to set foot in the Arab League, God forbid, because I'm an Israeli, despite the peace agreement of several decades. but there was absolutely no agreement amidst the members of the Arab League. There is a lot of hatred. There is a lot of killing and massacring and a lot of pretense and talk of solidarity. And one example is what had happened with Assad on the one hand, who was very much a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran that did exactly the same thing in Qatar and yet sat and cried together with the Qatari leadership. And you are talking about attacking a weak partner. There was nothing weak about the Islamic Republic of Iran with so many of its proxies like the Houthis, that didn't only hurt Israelis and Jews. It's not about Israel and the Jews. It's a pretext. Netanyahu is a pretext to deter attention away from the real threat, and that is the rising Islamist extremism, which is also threatening Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the West. It's not about Israel. Israel is at the forefront of this terrible, tragic fight. We don't like sending our boys to the front line. We don't like to hurt Palestinian mothers. We have no happiness in this issue. And I hate the fact that a person with an IV attached to him got hurt in a hospital. But the fact that the Hamas was underneath that hospital, planning, throwing, encouraging, enticing, massacring, murdering, burning, and raping our people from underneath that hospital is something that needs to be addressed and not Mr. Netanyahu. It's very nice to pretend that he's the issue, but he's not.
Okay. Jasmine, what do you say to that? And also let me ask you another question. We're going to move on to our final segment in just a moment. Do you think that this is happening at this particular point in time, this new strategic rearrangement in the Middle East, because the US has let down its Gulf partners?
Let me answer your second question first, because it's an easy answer, and the answer is yes. Ruth is talking about a lot of internal dynamics in the Arab world, and it's quite true that not all the Arab countries are always on the same page on everything. That certainly doesn't mean that they're not on the same page about the threat that the Netanyahu government and Israel under the Netanyahu government poses to regional security. That's certainly one thing that they all agree on. The second thing I'd like to say is that honestly, Ruth, it was very difficult for me to stay quiet and not interrupt you during your last intervention, but I did so out of respect. But I do have to say that I find it absolutely malicious and disingenuous to trot out the Islamic boogeyman every time someone attacks Israel. This whole idea that we are fighting this for the West, that Israel is sending our boys in Gaza to die for you in Paris. I completely reject that. That is a propaganda talking point, respectfully, and it is absolutely not true.
We send it because they want to murder our people.
I let you speak, even though it was very difficult for me to stay quiet while you were speaking. So I'd appreciate the same respect from you.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
Okay, you had your opportunity, and you can have your opportunity again, but I will respond to what you were saying. What is happening in Gaza is beyond anything that I've seen in my lifetime. That doesn't make October 7th any less awful and abhorrent and horrific. But what is happening in Gaza today is worse than anything we've ever seen. And it is being live streamed, and we have evidence of it. And it is a shame and a stain on humanity. And it's not just because Hamas is hiding under tunnels. Okay? Multiple doctors have the children that are being sniped in the head multiple times, the boys that are being shot in the testicles when they go into the hospital, and 20 of them show up with the same marks in the same places. That's not because of Hamas. I could go on and on, but I won't, because I don't want Melinda to lose her mind here.
We only have a little bit more time, and I want to keep us focused on our topic. So I'm going to move us on so I can bring the Senator back in as well, because when we look at this new security arrangement, since Hamas's October 7 attack, Israel has struck Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Yemen, and Qatar in the name of self-defense, according to the Israeli government. And that has, in turn, dialed up the temperature across the region. So in response, we are seeing a lot of diplomatic movement to strengthen positions. For example, Egypt and Turkey are coming together, mending relations and holding joint war games. Senator, I want to know from you, is this bilateral mutual defence deal just the beginning? Are we seeing the groundwork for what some analysts and commentators are calling an Islamic NATO?
Well, I don't like the word NATO because NATO is a relic of the Cold War, and NATO's role has been very negative, even after the end of the Soviet Union. But yes, there is a feeling that the time has come for Muslim countries or countries which face threats to come together and also beef up their military strength. For starters, of course, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have taken this initiative, which has been, by the way, welcomed from countries like Egypt and Iran also, incidentally. And then you would know that Turkey's aerospace industries is establishing what is called the K-A-A-N fighter jets, in which Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Indonesia are interested. And at the same time, Pakistan and Turkey have a very strong bilateral arrangement on defense issues, on defense joint production issues. And then now Egypt and Turkey are doing the same. So I think this pattern is going to increase bilaterally and also perhaps multilaterally because of Israeli aggression and American inability to leash Netanyahu. And so that knows that America is no longer a country they can rely on. In the past, it was they were seen as American allies and they were banking on Washington. But I think that's no longer the case. In any case, there's a retrenchment of American power. We also in Pakistan feel that the global balance of economic and political power is shifting from the West to the East. It's an Asian century. And also the so-called rules-based international order is unraveling before our own eyes, in any case, because of this hypocrisy and double standards of the West. So yes, we're moving in that direction.
Ruth, how do you think Israel would view an expanded alliance, an expanded military pact that if Saudi and Pakistan are just the start?
We see the Turkish-Egyptian alliance as potentially very difficult and threatening. I think this is how it should be seen. They are traditional non-allies. In fact, there was a lot of tension traditionally between Sisi and Erdogan. But there was a very, I would call it disturbing war game, as you had said, recently, the first one in 13 years. And yes, this is something that is very concerning, particularly since Egypt has not permitted the supervision recently of the peace agreement that we had signed in 1979. And this is something that we find worrying, especially since we value the agreement between us and Egypt as something which is very important and strategically something to maintain. And this is the way that it has been for years. I do want to say that everything that I say is very genuine. I have zero disingenuity in me, and I don't read any talking points. I represent no one but myself. We send our boys to the front line because if we don't, they will kill us, the civilians. And when I say our boys, it's all of us. It's our sons, it's our cousins, it's our nephews, all of us. We have no choice because of our numbers, despite the technological edge. But yes, the West will fight the same war very, very soon because extremist Islamist forces are very much a force in Europe and in Canada and in Australia and in the US. And I'm sure that you know this because you've been inside the institutions.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so I'm going to give a final word to you as well, Jasmine, to round out our panel. Do you think we are going to see a broader and expanded version of this mutual defence pact across the region?
I do. I think you're going to start seeing alliances being formed, maybe out of necessity, but formed nevertheless, because I just want to come back to those two things that I said in the beginning, trust and accountability. And with both of those things having been eroded after the Qatar strike, I think people are starting to think differently. One point that I think hasn't been made, maybe I'll just close on that, Melinda, which I think has huge ramifications, because there is a consensus within Israel and the Israeli military and security and political elite that they can continue towards normalization without having to make any huge concessions when it comes to a Palestinian state and so on. And I think that is going to be somewhat they're going to have to rethink those assessments, because when the Arab countries and the Gulf states, especially now, are saying we are not going to normalize unless you make progress on the Palestinian issue, they mean it. And when a country like Saudi Arabia signs a defense agreement with Pakistan with that nuclear clause and that nuclear umbrella, it allows them to withstand any potential American pressure on Saudi Arabia to enter into a normalization deal that they don't want to, using a U.S.-Saudi defense pact as a carrot. So if the U.S. now goes to Saudi Arabia and says, normalize with Israel, we know we don't want to, but we'll give you a defense pact if you normalize with Israel. Now the Saudis can come and say, we're not in a hurry. We have the defense agreement with Pakistan. We have that nuclear clause. We are going to bide our time, and we are going to normalize when we want to normalize and when we see what we want to see. So I think that's just a point that hasn't been made yet, which I think is quite significant.
I could see you wanting to say something there, Ruth. Do you want to make one last final comment before we wrap?
No, I think that what was said by Jasmine is correct.
Well, it has been an impassioned debate, so perhaps it's a good idea that we end on that small glimmer of consensus. These are difficult topics, they're sensitive topics, and so I do appreciate all of you for taking the time to make such insightful responses. It is why we love this show, Counterpoints, because these are very conflicting viewpoints, and we're glad to be able to convey all of them to our audience. So thank you to our panelists. Joining us on this episode, Senator Mushahid Hussain, former Pakistani Minister of Information and Culture, Jasmine El-Gamal, host of the View From Here podcast and a former Pentagon Middle East advisor, and Ruth Wasserman-Landi, a former Israeli Knesset member for the opposition Blue and White Party. Thank you to all of you for being on Counterpoints. And thank you to you for tuning in to this episode of Counterpoints. Keep up to date with all of our latest debates and special interviews by subscribing to Arabiya English on YouTube. And don't forget to follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.